Well, I think it was Isaac Newton who said that he'd only achieved anything by standing on the shoulders of giants. And certainly for this conference yesterday and today, I can say that so much of what I'm going to say this morning builds on what John has just said, on what Annette Michaud said yesterday, and what several other speakers said in the sessions I was able to get to yesterday. So I hope that to some extent this will be reinforcement for some emerging themes from this conference, which I know Adam will be succinctly summarising at the end today. And you actually used a very good word, reinvestment. That's a better word than reinventing, because that's a little bit pretentious. In fact, a lot of this presentation is quite pretentious, and I'm going to have a bit of a rant, which is why I'm going to move around the stage a bit, and I'm not going to get through my slides on the basis that I never do. They're designed not to be got through. Incidentally, where do I get a clicker to actually move that thing when I'm remote? Is there one over here? So what do I press? That? Yes. Okay, I'd just like to go back. I'd like to acknowledge the contributions to all of this work of my colleagues, Dr. Kate Freiberg and Dr. Sarah Branch. This does not happen in a vacuum, and there are always extremely bright and capable women who make this all happen. That's the guy who stands in front. That's a law of nature, it seems. Now, these are my 4 interwoven themes. I'm not going to get through them all. I want to really treat this morning as a teaching session as much as a rant and a plea to our field. The themes are developmental prevention. What is it? John talked about early intervention. It's a phrase I don't actually like very much for reasons I'll explain. So what is developmental or early prevention, and why do it? I want to talk about the mixed success, both internationally and particularly in this country, in the area of early prevention. And probably the key thing I want to say today, and this is where we might even stop, is this acronym CREATE, which we've put together as a way of trying to summarise what we see as the 5 key elements, or is it 6? 1, 2, 3, 6 key elements in what should be now a collaborative, community-based approach to early prevention. And really how we can move ahead in this field in Australia. This connects with what Annette Michaud said yesterday about the 1999 Pathways to Prevention report, which I had the privilege of chairing the consortium that wrote that report and producing a lot of that report myself. She was right. We need now something to galvanise us all in this country, and it's in a climate of political, not only political paralysis, but political imbecility and stupidity, and my vocabulary fails when one thinks about the quality of the political climate, both state and federally, in this country at the moment. We've got to rise beyond that. We've got to reinvent this whole field. We've got to inspire these bloody politicians to take some risks to support this approach. So I want to describe what this new model is, and then if we get time, talk about the foundations, and some of that will come anyway, but in the earlier sections, but we'll see what happens. So first of all, going back to first principles, I said I'm going to try and teach, and that sounds a bit arrogant, but I think we need to be reminded of some of these key principles. Now, the whole life course developmental perspective, I think the basic point is that law-abiding, peaceable people are a product of a long-term process, which Urie Bronfenbrenner called the process of making human beings human. That's what we're all engaged in as parents, as schools, as communities. It's the struggle to turn this raging beast, Homo sapien, and if you've dealt with 2- and 3-year-olds, you'll know what I'm talking about. Richard Tremblay, famous criminologist, talks about, I think, the age of 3 being the most violent age in the human life course. And it's taming those destructive impulses, if you like, that are inherent in human nature, and I want to use that word deliberately, that is what the whole human socialisation process is about. And that's what we're engaged in this developmental life course perspective. Now, but it's not only the final product that matters. We've got to remember that children should be valued now for what they are. They are beings, not just becomings. There's a big tendency in this field of early prevention to say, well, we do this because eventually we get a cost-effective way of preventing crime 15 years, 20 years later. Yes, that's true. But there are also compelling scientific and humanistic reasons for raising the welfare of children now. And that matters now. And those of you who've worked or work in the area of child protection will know exactly what I'm talking about. So children are beings, not just becomings. We should be focusing on better outcomes for children now, not just into the future. Let's get away a little bit from this emphasis on children and young people achieving their potential. Yes, I believe in that, but let's have a more sociological approach to this, to thinking about this. It's not only individuals achieving their potential, it's about children and young people having the right to access opportunities to fully participate as citizens in this society, in this democratic society. So crime prevention at its essence is a democratic or a democratizing process. It's about inclusion. John was head of the social exclusion unit. We talk about social inclusion in this country. That's another dimension, another way of thinking about crime prevention. For all of those reasons, it's imperative to act early. This is the idea of early intervention, to avoid poor outcomes or the closing off of options in health, education, behaviour and crime. So all of these things are linked. We've heard about this repeatedly over the 2 days of this conference. Crime prevention matters, but you can't really do it unless you also think about health, education, child protection and all these allied fields, substance abuse and so on. And all of these poor outcomes in all of these areas have huge costs to society, particularly through second generation effects, which are so evident in our Indigenous communities, second, third, fourth generation effects. Pathways to Prevention project is a long-term early prevention project in a disadvantaged region of southwest Brisbane that I've been engaged in with Mission Australia and a whole group of primary schools, in state primary schools in the area since the early 2000s. Acting early before problems emerge or before they become entrenched. That's the key. Now, if I had time, I'd explain the logo of the Pathways project. And there's a funny story behind that I don't have time to tell you. The 1999 report, Pathways to Prevention, Annette and other people have referred to that. There's still a lot of good material in there, but it now does need to be updated. And that was reinforced for me yesterday by Annette's comments that probably now is the time to try and put together something which is contemporary state of the art and what needs to be done. Yes, this was good, it was useful, amazingly. If you knew the process of making sausages, you're always sceptical about the product, but this one did seem to come together. Well, we need to do it again, perhaps in a slightly less ambitious format. So how do we do this work of early prevention? I want to try and, again, go back to some basics. John mentioned the first point, which is we've got to understand the problems in context, or we've got to understand local conditions, I think was your word. If we don't understand what we're doing, that is the community we're working in, or the nature of the problem, or the population which we're trying to influence the behaviour of or outcomes for, then we're not going to make a lot of progress. And this is essential if we're going to do the process of translation, what the US Society for Prevention Research calls the type 2 translational work, where we take evidence-based programs and we convert them into larger scale programs or services of the nature that John described a few minutes ago. The second point is that this analysis of problems in context helps us to think about what needs to change in the local situation, in the local community that we might be working in. It's changes in social arrangements that is in fact the focus of prevention, although better measured outcomes for children and ultimately lower rates of crime is the bottom line. Nevertheless, how do we achieve that? Well, we don't go in with a magic wand and suddenly children start to function better in all the domains of their life. What we do, we bring various kinds of resources, skills, human capital, social capital, financial resources, connections to many institutions and influential people. We bring all of these kinds of resources to bear on often what are very, very struggling communities and these 120, whatever it was, thousand multi-problem families. But it's about sitting down with these communities, with these schools, with these families, community groups, ethnic organisations, sharing our time. That's a resource I should have emphasised. Time, skills, connections, knowledge, that are going to lead to system changes ultimately, certainly changes in local social arrangements, to help people solve problems or overcome barriers to meaningful participation in the larger society. This is the way we think about risk factors. We think about risk factors as essentially statistical measures of the gap between the resources people have got and the resources they need in order to participate fully and to overcome the barriers or the problems that they're currently facing. Now, that sounds complicated, but actually it makes a huge amount of sense when you're a service provider in a local area and you want to work from a strengths-based perspective. You've understood the problems in context. Instead of going in and saying, well, here's a child at risk, which the UK does too much, they've converted the whole risk-focused approach to prevention to how do we control the most at risk and coincidentally working class young population and keep them under control and particularly under surveillance. That's a bit of a caricature, John. I'm trying to provoke you into a response later on. So we're trying to use a more humanistic, a more actually realistic framework for thinking about risk and protective factors by counterposing the resources people have in very disadvantaged situations and the resources they need, and analysing and understanding that gap and walking with them as we help to bridge that gap. You know, we'll see those graphs come closer together as we do this. Sorry, I'm erasing myself. In all relevant social contexts, actually we could have a whole week's lecture on each of these points, but I'm going to have to speed up a bit. What do I mean by all relevant social contexts? If you know anything about this work, you'll know that this is about ecological approaches. This is about working simultaneously with children, with parents, with schools, with community agencies, and with community services. It's about doing things simultaneously in different contexts, and it's about the connections between those contexts. It's also, given the life course perspective, the fact that it takes human beings a long time to grow up. Men, we're told now, adolescence extends to about the age of 30. I won't get into that controversy, but my own observations suggest that it might be true. But certainly there are crucial points of transition in life. Getting born is a crucial life transition. If you don't get born successfully, it's a problem. Now, I'm not just joking. Obviously, if you're dead, the whole game doesn't start. But if you're born prematurely, that has profound consequences for almost everything we're interested in this room today. And so supporting traditional public health approaches that are going to reduce prematurity would be a profoundly important crime prevention technique. Let's just think about that. But there are other crucial life transitions. Going to school, being ready for school. Going to high school is a grossly neglected life transition, both in terms of the research that underpins our knowledge of what makes for a successful transition, and more particularly in terms of resources and programs and services that are available to help kids from very disadvantaged communities make that transition successfully. We talk about evidence-based programs, very, very important. I'm the most passionate advocate that's here for introducing evidence-based programs, but it's not just through specific programs. More importantly, and John said it, it's through the transformation of the developmental system, especially institutional policies and practices, and the final outcome of all of that is that we create attractive societal access routes, not just individual developmental pathways, although they're the bottom line, but creating these attractive access routes, opportunities for participation. I've written a paper on this. If you're interested in, there's actually quite a lot of theory, a lot of research underneath each of these 9 points. But I wanted to spend some time at the beginning laying out what I see as the critical theoretical and research foundations, and in order to adumbrate the framework, the way we think about this work. And I guess John would say, it's too bloody complicated, Hommel. We can't remember 9 points. Reduce it to 3. Well, you can't. Maybe you could reduce it to 6. I've thought of ways I could do that. But It makes sense to me, but I've been thinking about this for 10 years or more, 15, 20 years. This is my way of trying to summarise a lot of the material that's in that report back in 1999 and certainly is present in the very rich research and practice literature in this field. Now, I've talked about systems change, developmental systems. The work we're doing in Pathways to Prevention is very much about trying to strengthen that system. And I talked about actions working in different settings, such as schools and home. It's important to do that, but it's also important to understand the connections, or often the lack of connection, between, for example, home and school. There are women in our region, young women with young children, who won't go through the school gate because their own experience of school was so negative. Now, that's a barrier. I remember I talked about barriers and how do you overcome those barriers. You're not going to get a good outcome for kids. You're going to get behavioural problems, all sorts of issues as the kids grow in terms of poor behaviour if those gaps are allowed to persist. So it's about strengthening the connections, but more generally, all parts of the child's developmental system must be in harmonious, mutually reinforcing relationships. So what goes on in the school should reinforce what happens in the home and vice versa. And the school should not be isolated from the community services, which they need in order to deal with the family problems that cause the behavioural issues that the schools have to try and deal with. See, everything's connected, and it's understanding and building those mutually reinforcing system relations or connections that is another way of thinking about the nature of this work. We've published on this as well if anyone wants to follow up on any of these points. Now, this is an American representation. This is from Richard Lerner and his colleague Castellino, a way of trying to depict developmental system. I usually put that up just for a joke and move on. Yes, it is complex, but human society is complex. You'll notice that there's an arrow, the time arrow goes right through the middle of it. This is not only complex, it changes, it's dynamic. And it goes right from the inner biological, where the child is here in the middle and the nuclear family, right out to community, society, culture, and the designed and natural environments. How do you make sense of all of that, and how do you work with it in developmental science? Obviously, it has to be simplified in the real world. And that's one simplification that we have made, which is essentially the framework that I've been describing for our Pathways to Prevention work. The child is still the centre as part of a family, so better outcomes for children and parents, as measured quantitatively with reliable and believable measures over time, is the bottom line. But it's building these connections between children and families, community services and the schools that has been the primary focus of our work for the last 10 years. This is about building community capacity at the local level, but it's also about building those connections and strengthening those systems and policy responses at the level of the head office, culture and policies. And John's summary of all of that was brilliant. And that's exactly what we failed to achieve fully so far in our work in this project, but we've had a go at it. Now, we talk about evidence and we talk about pathways and change. Now, I'm not going to go through this. We don't have time. It's too much to take in now. I just wanted to show this to you. This is part of the theoretical model, or if you like, what do they call it? The theory of change that underlies our Pathways work. And I'll just draw your attention to a few of those domains. So, for example, preschool programs for children are designed to have an influence on children's skills for learning, social competence, problem-solving skills, and so on, which should increase children's attachment to school and their motivation to learn, which in turn should lead to better educational outcomes, measurable improvements in well-being, and reductions in poor behaviour, antisocial behaviour and offending. And there are many interrelated pathways in there. We've got measures of all of these boxes and most of these variables, and we're just in the process of working on a longitudinal database that we've created of 6,000 children out of our project to more fully quantify a lot of those pathways. But I said before, everything's connected to everything else. So there are key pathways in here like improving parental efficacy, their sense of being in control as a parent and connected to supports and services they need in order to do their job as a parent. That is fundamentally important to crime prevention because it flows right through to all of these outcomes that we're interested in. We've got empirical evidence for that. And so to illustrate that, this is my way of trying to summarise what we've learned over the last few years from our data analysis, and which we're still working on, but of course we've really only begun to exploit the full power of our database, and thank goodness for Adam and his colleagues. They've given us some funding through the criminology research grants to expand this work. Thank you, Adam. Now, what we've been able to show is that participation in the various intervention programs over the years through pathways has led to a measurable improvement in parental efficacy and their connectedness, as I mentioned a moment ago, which improves really something absolutely critical, their involvement in their children's learning, enriching the home environment for learning, so that children are more ready to learn at prep, or I think it's kindergarten still in New South Wales, isn't it, the first year of school, which leads to better school achievement, better behaviour, better measured social and emotional well-being in the late primary years, a better transition to high school, lower risk factors for adolescence, and less youth crime. We've got data on every one of these fragments or elements of pathways right through to this point here. We don't have this yet because we haven't had quite long enough for the preschoolers to. Well, actually, that's pretty sad. When we were doing the longitudinal follow-up for the transition to high school, we were trying to track some of the kids who'd been in our preschool program back in 2002 who'd moved schools. We rang up one of the principals who said, oh yes, that lad, he was here, but now he's in youth detention. This was a 12-year-old Aboriginal. So that's one case I know at least of failure, if you like, a kid who hasn't made that transition to high school successfully. Now, I thought I'd spend just 2 minutes reinforcing this evidence base, which I've just described from our own Pathways work in Australia, by summarising the evidence from a large number of rigorously designed and implemented early prevention programs in the United States where they have measured outcomes into the adolescent years. So this bears on the question of the quality of the evidence base that John said is still questioned. We've published this meta-analysis a couple of years ago now in a US journal. We're looking at the effects of early prevention programs for kids up to the age of 5 in disadvantaged populations on a range of adolescent outcomes. Let's just look quickly at the evidence. We included a variety of types of early prevention programs. This makes our meta-analysis fairly unusual. Most meta-analyses only focus, for example, on one type of program. We've used 5: structured preschools, centre-based childcare, home visitation programs like David Old's, family nurse partnerships, family support services of the kind that all the NGOs working at the community level in this country are engaged in, and parent education like Triple P. And these are the specific programs. They're nearly all American. I think they're all American. Maybe there's one from England. I'm not sure. I'd have to check that. But famous projects like the Abecedarian Project, the Chicago Child Parent Centres, the Perry Preschool Program, etc., etc. So these are the ones where they met the conditions of rigour, scientific rigour, and they had outcomes into the adolescent years. We looked at 5 domains of outcomes, from educational success, cognitive development, social and emotional development, deviance, social participation, involvement in the criminal justice system, and family well-being. Because these were all measures from these domains were available from most, or some at least, of these programs. And that's what we found. They're the effect sizes across those outcome domains when you combine the effects of all of the different kinds of programs. And I'll tell you what effect sizes mean in a moment, but you'll notice that the largest average effect was in terms of educational achievement, educational outcomes, followed by deviance. This is antisocial behaviour, the Attorney General mentioned graffiti, all that kind of stuff. And involvement in the criminal justice system also fairly substantial effects. But SP, I've forgotten what that stands for, that's social participation, also very big effects. Less impressive measured effects in terms of social emotional deviance or well-being, social emotional development rather, and family well-being. But that could reflect the nature of the measures that we used 15, 20 years ago, 30 years ago, rather than, anyway. So the overall effect size, 0.313. Now remember, this is programs implemented for the early years with follow-ups at age 15, 18, 19 and so on, so quite some years later. That average effect size corresponds to a 62% difference, a 62% reduction in the problem behaviour, if you like, or 62% improvement in the positive outcomes in the intervention groups compared with the control group. So that's a way of trying to convert this fairly hard to understand concept of an effect size into a meaningful real life effect. Now, I'm quite happy with a 62% reduction in poor outcomes in adolescence from an early in life program. Thank you very much. It may still be in the moderate to small range, but that'll do me, thank you very much. And the cost-benefit analyses, cost-effectiveness analyses that have been done of many of these programs show that those reductions or those improvements are achieved very cost-effectively. The Perry Preschool program, it depends on which evaluation you read. The more hard-nosed ones that have been done by people like James Heckman, the Nobel Prize-winning economist, suggest that there's something of the order of $12 to $15 payback for every dollar invested. And they've followed their sample up to age 40 in the most recent report. What point am I making here? I'm saying don't just believe my data. If we must, let's believe the Americans. Because they've actually got the best data, they do the most innovative work, they do things at large scale, they're prepared to take risks, they actually do all the things which we talk about but we don't do. And the reality is that's the evidence base that is still inspiring this field. And I would take this evidence into any politician's office, any sceptical bureaucrat, and I'd argue, no, you find fault in this and tell me why you should not be investing in this. Now, yes, okay, so we've got all these evidence-based programs, and the traditional model, we've talked about scaling up this morning. Well, the traditional model, here's your randomised controlled trial. You go out and spruik the results. You get someone like me, or preferably someone better looking like her, to go and present the results. And then it converts into a wonderful service for families or children or whatever, and everyone's smiling and everyone's happy, and the world becomes a happy, bright, sunny place. That's the theory. Well, that's the reality, thanks to Peter Hommel. A little bit of modern art from Berlin, was it, Peter? It all tends to get mixed up in practice. And as we know, when we move to scale, things tend to fall over. And as Mark Greenberg, a colleague of Brian Bumbarger's from Penn State, director of the Prevention Research Centre, said in a seminar here in Australia in 2009, I wrote it down furiously, in the real world, translations of science-based practices stumble largely unguided toward uneven, incomplete and socially disappointing outcomes. Well, we've heard a lot about that from John and from other speakers over the last 2 days. And the problems of crime prevention internationally, and thanks again to Brother Peter for reminding me of some of these points, there's a failure of understanding and overuse of punishment responses. I think the centrality of police in public thinking about how you do crime prevention illustrates that. Available theory is inadequately applied or poorly developed. There are major implementation problems which we're familiar with. evaluations are done badly or not at all. I'm absolutely fed up with major government programs, state and federal, in all of the sectors I've referred to, being funded where they don't measure anything. Families First in New South Wales was a wonderful program which didn't measure any bloody thing at all. Communities for Children, which I'll talk a bit about in a moment. And how long have I got? 10 minutes more ranting? Can you deal with that? I'm just getting warmed up. We don't measure anything. How can we expect to know anything? And governance arrangements keep changing. Now, this is, again, Peter's summary of the Australian experience. A lot of huff and puff, a lot of barking, a lot of noise. Not a lot to show for it, I suspect. And if there is a lot to show for it, you can't demonstrate it because we don't measure anything. So, I'm reminded of the poem by A.D. Hope, the famous Australian poet, who wrote a poem called Australia. You should go back and read it. It was A.D. Hope on a bad day, but he talked about second-hand Europeans pullulating timidly on the edge of alien shores. He talked about the desert, the intellectual desert that this country represented, I think back in the 60s when he wrote that poem. Well, you know, I still think there's a lot of truth in it. I think one of the fundamental problems in this country is a poverty of imagination, a kind of intellectual constipation about how to do this kind of work, a lack of willingness to take risks, no vision, no imagination, no drive, no passion. At the very best, we get good intentions instead of practice influenced by scientific evidence. We get gross overuse of what I think of as community. I'm a great believer in community development and social crime prevention. It just happens not to have any scientific foundation. I mean, I wish it did, but we've put billions into building community capacity, first without understanding what that means, and secondly without measuring anything, and thirdly without knowing whether we've achieved it when we've done it. This has been the history since at least I've been active as a professional back in the early 1970s with the Australian Assistance Plan. There's an overemphasis on program packages and a limited attention to enduring social institutions. We have what we called in 1999 the pilot program disease. As soon as something looks like it's going to work, egalitarian, equality considerations mean we've got to move the funding somewhere else so somebody else can have a go. So we kill off all the most successful innovations because they've had their turn, haven't they? And over control by government, micromanagement, etc., etc., etc. So in Australia, we've largely failed to build a body of scientific knowledge. We've not capitalised on what I think of as the competitive advantage that I think Pathways to Prevention actually gave us back in 1999. This is particularly in the field of crime prevention. Actually, all of these allied fields, child protection, mental health, substance abuse, community services, and some others, have actually taken the results of Pathways to heart and have done a much better job in many respects in moving ahead in practice with implementing the principles that we were talking about. There's been an almost total failure in the field of crime prevention to develop any body of knowledge in this country about how to do this work. We could have decided in 1999 that we wanted to take communities that care as our evidence-based prevention delivery system. And we could have done it. We could have developed our own body of evidence around communities that care. We didn't. The UK had a go at it and made a mess of it. We didn't even bother to have a go. So you've got my colleague John Tombaru from Deakin University in Victoria still struggling with 3 or 4 communities to get communities that care actually, and with totally inadequate funding. It's pathetic. It's absolutely scandalous that nobody's blowing the whistle on the scandalous situation. Now, the best hope we've got, I think, is Communities for Children, which is the federal program operating in about 50 disadvantaged communities. Annette Michaud talked about it yesterday. I share her generally positive assessment of it. If you look at their website, the FACSIA website, they do talk about a lot of programs that do have a strong evidence base. What we don't know is actually which ones have been implemented where, for how long, with how many children, with what outcomes, and how well they were implemented. All the things we need to know, apart from having them say it on a website, we don't know. Because, well, they've got this unique collaborative model. Well, it's not really collaborative, and if I had another 3/4 of an hour, I'd explain why, but I don't. There are no measures of quality of program implementation in communities for children, except what local non-government agencies might do at their own initiative. There's no measure of individual child or parent outcomes for those exposed to the program. There's no systematic analysis of patterns of participation. Nevertheless, they were able successfully to use 3 waves of the longitudinal study of Australian children to do an evaluation which found that fewer C4C community children were living in jobless households, parents reported less hostile or harsh parenting practices, and parents felt more effective in their roles as parents. However, the evaluation also showed that C4C parents reported lower levels of child physical functioning, and C4C mothers with low education or income had poorer mental or general health than the non-C4C communities. So for me, that's a pretty mixed set of results. On the whole, it's positive. Most effects were positive but small, and most comparisons were not statistically significant. So look, yes, A for effort, C for outcomes, but still a pass. It's a good model. It is actually a really good model. We can do so much more with it in this country if we took it seriously as a prevention delivery framework for all the things we're actually interested in. So the challenge, and I'm going to finish with the next 2 or 3 slides, Adam, so to reduce your stress level, we need to create a prevention delivery system. I'm using that phrase deliberately. This is what Brian and his colleagues, Brian Bumberger and his colleagues talk about in the US. It's a US phrase. It's one I've decided to adopt. So a prevention delivery system is the way you structure things at the, if you like, at the macro level. It's like a computer operating system, as opposed to the specific programs like Microsoft Word or PowerPoint that you use. So that's the distinction. Communities That Care is a prevention delivery system. It's not actually a specific program, because what you do in those communities is select evidence-based programs for implementation, and that can vary from community to community depending on the risk profile. If you went to Brian's presentation yesterday, you would have heard a beautiful summary of that process. So the challenge when we're working in disadvantaged communities in this country is to create a prevention delivery system that transforms the developmental system, is therefore potentially sustainable, because when the system gets transformed, when schools and services and community functioning starts to change at that system level, then the conditions are in place for things to keep going ahead even when funding stops for specific programs. So the aim is to transform the developmental system. It's therefore sustainable, is effective in highly disadvantaged communities. Now, one of the drawbacks that Mark Greenberg pointed out to me of Communities That Care, it's a great evidence-based model, good prevention delivery system. It's never been properly tested or shown to be effective in socially disadvantaged communities. Most of the evidence comes from rural or suburban communities at the moment. Now, I'm not saying it couldn't work in disadvantaged communities, but I can see some good reasons why it might not be the best model. Our Pathways model, which I'm about to describe, the new model of collaborative practice, we believe is, on the basis of our work and all of our research, is best tailored for the needs of disadvantaged communities, not only in this country, but we think internationally. In other words, what I'm proposing is another prevention delivery system. It's got to be collaborative. It's got to incorporate program elements that I think are all evidence-based, and John very well summarised those issues. And it has to achieve measurable quantitative improvements in both short and long-term outcomes for children and young people. So the short-term outcomes matter. So reduced antisocial behaviour, improved social and emotional well-being matter now, because they all have substantial costs, human and financial costs now. But they also matter because they're the essential building blocks, harking back to my earlier diagram, they're the essential building blocks for youth crime prevention. over time. Remember, this is a life course developmental perspective. And it's got to be cost effective. So that's the challenge. That's what I'd like to challenge you all to think about. Now, I'm going to present my model, our model, for doing all of this. But it's not yet tested because we're searching for the funding to actually give it a go and do it in a really full-blooded way. I'll skip that just to say I've already said we've developed the database out of our work over the last 10 years, but the collaborative model is also another major product of our work. And here it is. This is a way of just summarising it in terms of that acronym CREATE. So the outcome, better lives for children in disadvantaged communities. The foundation is stronger developmental systems founded on good governance and the empowerment of parents, the empowerment of children, and the empowerment of teachers and community workers. Everybody wins in this model. C for collaborative. And by collaborative, I don't just mean a partnership. I think, again, John and Annette Michaud both referred to the need for integrated approaches where everything works in harmony with everything else. You won't achieve this without changing your governance arrangements and actually changing the incentive systems for schools, for agencies to work together in such a way that each are ceding a certain amount of power in exchange for the opportunity to do something that's genuinely integrated or collaborative to achieve better measurable outcomes for children. Incidentally, those of you furiously writing, and thank you very much, it does mean you're not asleep. It's encouraging at this stage. I do have a small number of pamphlets or brochures which summarise this model and also make the case for why your department should give us a large amount of money and partnership and a linkage grant to actually do this. So I'm happy to sign you up at the end of this session. So C for collaborative, R for relationships driven. We could talk about this for a whole hour. You can't get anywhere, particularly in these very challenging communities, if you don't build relationships and trust. And do you know what? That takes time. Good God, I sound like Kevin Rudd. I'm sorry. So it's R for relationships or relations, connections. Early in the pathway, I've emphasised that. It's got to be accountable. You've got to set goals. They've got to be clear enough to be measured. And you know, most of what we do at the local level or at the human services level isn't, in that sense, accountable. Because the goals actually, when you boil them all down, are not exactly clear. And they're not able to be converted to precise measures which can be recorded and used for outcome evaluation. T for training. I talked about empowerment. This is about giving the workforce and the community, the families, the skills that are needed to build efficacy and to achieve goals for children. And finally, evidence-based. Programs and services should have clear evidence for their effectiveness and are able to be implemented with integrity. That second phrase is vital for the reasons that we've heard so much about in this conference. Now, I could talk about how we've already begun work on this. We've created a website which is basically empty, but has all the bits that we want to fill. It has some of our, what I think to be very innovative measures, interactive computer game, for example, that measures the well-being, the social emotional well-being of primary age children, which we've now validated on 4,000 children. This is an excellent measure of child well-being that kids love to do because it's a game on a computer. We've got those resources now on a website, and we have started to develop the other resources that are needed to actually make this happen. So, watch this space. We're passionate about this. For me, for my team, this represents the fruits of 10 years of research and thinking. We think it's right. It's probably wrong in some detail, but overall it's right. I leave it with you for reflection. Thank you, Adam.